the
Yeah.
glare.
We could do a close-up on that.
Oh, so you arrived. I hope your travels from London were not too arduous. I am so glad to have you here. Welcome to my home at Down. This is a very unusual day. I am actually feeling quite well. Usually I have to turn visitors away due to ill health, but today I feel quite fit as a fiddle. So welcome. I should let Emma know you're here. Emma, the Americans are here, darling. Yes, yes, I know. I shan't be late. Of course not. Emma is very excited. We had our first grandchild a year and a half ago, and my son Francis is bringing the young fellow up to visit us tonight. And Emma has made it very clear I shall not be late for dinner. Not tonight. Actually, I'm very fond of sweets, but I am not allowed to have them on doctor's orders. But on a night like tonight, with a little grandson in the house, I don't think anyone will say anything if I sneak a few sweets. So I do not want to miss that dinner. So I'm afraid if I hear the carriage bringing Francis along, I will have to leave you rather suddenly. I apologize for that ahead of time. But welcome for now. Allow me. I'm sorry, I'm so rude. I should take off my hat and coat. That's better. I have just come back from my own walk. Every day I walk the gravel path across the grounds here at Down. It's called the Sand Walk for my family. I often pause to admire the natural history along the way. I often lose myself in thought. I once overheard our gardener seeing me standing there, and he was talking to a friend of his, and he says, "The poor fellow just stands and stares at flowers for hours on end. It would be better if he had something to do." But Emma has been an amazing support for me, my wisest advisor, my kindest caregiver through all my illnesses, which have taken so much of my time. I have never known her to miss an opportunity to a kindness for another human being. I have often wondered why a woman who is so much my superior in every moral quality ever consented to be my wife. You know, when I was a young man, just back from the voyage of the Beagle before I was married, I took the time to write down my thoughts about marriage and whether I should actually participate in such a thing. And I have copied that down. Where have I put it? Yes, a new illustration has just arrived. I will share this with you later. Let's see, where did I put it? Here it is. I have copied this down many times because I like to tease Emma with it. So here it is, a young man's thoughts on marriage. The consequences of marriage, as I wrote when I was but 20-some years old. So forgive me, I was young and ignorant. Consequences of marriage: children, if it please God. Constant companion and friend in old age, who will always feel or at least act interested in me. Charms of music and female chit-chat. An object to be loved and played with, better than a dog anyway. This is when Emma usually strikes me with a pillow. Forced to visit her relatives. Oh, yes. Less money for books, possibly quarreling. Overall, a terrible loss of time. Now for not marrying. No children, no second life, no one to care for me in my old age. Freedom to go and do as I please. Conversation of clever men at my club. Not forced to visit her relatives. More time for one's own work. Yes, well, you might think I had decided, but I thought longer about it, and I ended with this. Still, it is intolerable to think of spending one's whole life like a neuter bee, working for nothing. Instead, picture yourself with a nice soft wife on a nice soft sofa with a good fire and books and music. Ah, yes, the callousness of youth. And yet, that has been much of our life here at Down. Incredibly happy life that she has given me. Every night, she reads to me. From novels, we're reading a Jane Austen novel now. I have two rules about the novels that we listen to. That is that they must have one character that you can absolutely love, and they must end happily. Those are my two rules for reading novels at night. And then, of course, our two games of backgammon. We have been doing this for years and years and years and keeping score. We're in the thousands now. She is slightly ahead of me, but I am hoping, with the distraction of the grandchild this evening, I might actually draw nearer. She bore us 10 children, 6 boys and 4 girls. Unfortunately, 3 of those died. Little Mary, when she was but 23 days old. Young Charles at 1.5 years. He was very slow to talk and walk, and Emma was convinced that he was mentally deficient. I had hoped he was just slow, but he was taken when only 1.5 years old. And then there was Annie. I'm sorry. 10 years old, so full of joy. I still see her on the sandwalk, pirouetting. But we have 7 wonderful children still with us. So they tell me you are from a university in the United States. I have a very good friend at a university there, Asa Gray at Harvard University. Perhaps you know him? I suppose not. I must say, my own time at university, although I enjoyed it, it was a trial for my father, I believe. My father was the kindest man I ever knew. He was also one of the largest men I ever knew. He stood 6'2" and weighed 335 pounds. He was so large that we had to cut a semicircle from our dining room table so he could sit comfortably at the table. He was a physician, as my grandfather was before him. A man of most amazing abilities, amazing sympathies for his patients, and able to deduce the illness with such quickness and clarity that he became quite widely known. In fact, this story is told that one day a gentleman came to him and my father examined him, and he said, "Well, I know what you have. You need to see the specialist, Dr. Winston. He's in London." And the man turned to him and said, "I am Dr. Winston." It gives you some idea of my father's renown. So it was decided that I would follow in his footsteps and study medicine. My older brother, Erasmus, old Ras, had already done so at Cambridge, and he was spending his time in the hospital wards in Edinburgh. So it was decided that I would join RAS in Edinburgh and begin my medical studies. Unfortunately, my father made it clear at that time that he was going to leave me a considerable fortune. And so I probably didn't need to make my own way in life. Anyway, I found the lectures at Edinburgh entirely dull. Dissection nauseated me, which was a great loss. For if I had learned the skills of dissection there, they would have served me so well later in my life. But the thing that ended my studies for medicine was witnessing 2 operations, one of them on a very small child. This was before the days of anesthesia. No chloroform at that time, as we have now, that blessed agent. And the screams of that poor child haunted me for a year. So it was decided that perhaps I was not meant for a career as a physician. And so we decided instead that perhaps I would attend Cambridge, where I could study religion. I was rather orthodox at that point in my life, and the idea of being a country curate was quite amenable to me. So I went to Cambridge to study religion. I find it ludicrous with how vehemently I have been attacked by some religious leaders that I actually studied religion at a university. Well, I'm afraid I fell in with a sporting, rather low-minded group of young men. Rather than studying, we spent our time riding and shooting and drinking and laughing and singing late into the night. And I must say, when I look back on my college experiences, those were some of the happiest days I had. My father, however, was not as pleased. And he wrote me a letter, and he said, "Charles, you care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your entire family." Yes, I had overspent my allowance, so that probably did not help. I did not waste all my time at Cambridge, however. At that time, I was an inveterate beetle collector. The coleoptera fascinated me. And there was nothing that gave me more pleasure than to see a new form of beetle described, and next to the illustration, to see collected by Charles Darwin, Esquire. I will give you an example of the zeal with which I chased those beetles. One day I was out peeling the bark away from a dead tree, which was a wonderful way to find beetles, and 2 of them scurried out, and I captured one with my left hand and the other in my right. And as I was turning away, a third most beautiful specimen crawled out from under the bark. What was I to do? Well, I popped one beetle into my mouth and reached for the other one. And the one in my mouth exuded the most acrid fluid that I nearly choked to death, losing that beetle and the third one. But the other I still had in this hand. My time there was not entirely wasted, however, for I very much enjoyed the study of natural history. And there were 2 professors who had a profound influence on me while I was there. Adam Sedgwick was a geologist, and he took me under his wing, but also took me into the field and trained me to read the history of the earth in the rocks that lay upon the surface. And then, of course, there was John Hinslow. Hinslow not only took me under his wing, he took me into his home. He would often take me into the field. We'd walk together. He was a wonderful botanist. I learned so much about the plants of the area from him. I was so frequently seen with him that the other professors, who could never remember my name, would often refer to me as, "You know, he's that young fellow who always walks with Hinslow." Well, it was actually Hinslow who made possible the most important event of my life, which of course was the voyage of the Beagle. You see, Robert Fitzroy had taken the Beagle on an expedition in the years before and had begun charting the coast of South America. But he had not finished that. And so he had brought the Beagle back and was refitting her in London. And he decided that he wanted a gentleman naturalist to accompany him, so that as he was on the high seas charting the areas, there could be this naturalist upon the land who would study the flora, fauna, and geology. And he had offered the position to Henslow. But Henslow kindly turned to me and recommended to Captain Fitzroy that I was just the man. I was so excited, I told my father, and he said, "Charles, this is no way to spend your time. A 2-year voyage around the world." And finally we came to words, and his last words were, "If you can find one man of common sense who believes this is a good idea, then I'll allow you to go." Huh. He was quite confident I could not, but I immediately thought of my Uncle Josiah Wedgwood. I often hunted on his estate, and Uncle Jos was not an overly friendly man, but we had a very close relationship. And I went to him and told him about this opportunity, and he thought it was wonderful. And I said, "Would you please go talk to Father?" And he immediately called up his carriage and drove 30 miles to see my father and tell him he thought this would be the making of me. Well, of course, my father could not object at that point. I had found the man he thought had the most common sense of any man, and he thought it was an excellent idea. I knew my father was upset, however. So I said, "Father, you know, I have overspent my allowance quite often at Cambridge, and it's angered you. But I would have to be deuced clever to overspend my allowance 100 miles at sea." And he turned to me and said, "Yes, Charles, but they tell me you are deuced clever." That voyage. It is interesting to me when I think back that my ability to go on that voyage hung on 2 things. One was the kindness of my uncle in driving that 30 miles to speak to my father. The other, as it turns out, hung on the shape of my nose. For you see, when I met Fitzroy, it turned out that he believed very strongly that he could tell the character of a man by the look of his nose. And I found out later that he thought my nose was not the type that would be determined enough, would be strong enough character to be able to survive 2 or 3 or 4 years at sea. And this was no little matter. The former captain of the Beagle had indeed become terribly despondent in the seas south of South America and had shot himself. So it was reasonable for Fitzroy to be worried about who he was taking on into his cabin. But I think he found out that my nose spoke falsely and he allowed me to go anyway. In the end, it was not my nose that I should have worried about, but my stomach. For you see, as soon as we were off the coast of England, I discovered that I was prone to seasickness. And so I spent most of the voyage lying in my hammock, quite ill. Let me describe the Beagle to you. Perhaps you will have a better idea of what I was experiencing. The Beagle was one of those ships that was known as a coffin brig. A coffin brig. Because they handled so poorly, they had a tendency to sink. 90 feet from stern to bow. 24 across the beam. For a man of my height, that is 30 paces from the stern to the bow and 30 paces back. 8 paces from one side to the other. That was my world for months and months. And much of that, I was ill. I was the first to strike land when we came to port, and I was the last aboard the boat when we left. Oh, that voyage. South America. Delight. Delight is a weak word to describe what a naturalist feels when he first walks through the forest of Brazil. The gracefulness of the plants, the complexity of the parasitic forms, the vivid green of the leaves of the jungle. One moment as silent as a cathedral, and the next deafening with the sound of insects. Or to lie by a fire after riding across the pampas of Argentina all day, and to watch the sparks of the fire rise into the sky and mix with the stars in a sky so black and full. All the while listening to an old gaucho singing some song of love and loss. It was a wonderful experience. If you ever have a chance for a voyage, even if you are seasick, I recommend you do it. It was there, of course, that some of my very orthodox religious views began to be challenged. For at the time, of course, orthodoxy preached that the earth was not very old. 6,000 years, perhaps. And it had been shaped by cataclysmic events like the biblical flood. Fossils were explained as the remnants of those species killed during the flood. And the idea that each species had been specially created by God, and once created, it did not change. These ideas had been challenged before. In fact, my grandfather Erasmus had written in his Zonomia that he believed that forms might change from one to another. But very few people believed that. But I began to see things there. Some of the fossils I collected in South America included the giant ground sloth, Mylodon, and a giant armadillo-like animal called Glyptodon. I sent those back to London, and I was not aware of it until I returned, but those were the fossils which made my reputation among the scientific men of England. They were so impressed, but they were impressed for the wrong reasons. What intrigued me was the fact that here in South America, the only place we found living sloths, we also found a fossil form. It was clearly a sloth. And here in South America, the only place we found armadillos. Again, a fossil form that was clearly related to armadillos. So we are left with a conundrum. A creator who destroys a sloth and an armadillo only to create another sloth and another armadillo in the same place. It seemed much more likely that in fact there was an ancestral sloth or an ancestral armadillo which gave rise to these various forms, some of which became extinct and some of which survived. It was also the time I began to question the length of time the earth had existed. Charles Lyell had written a book on geology, and Henslow had given me that book to read on the voyage. And in that book, Lyell had argued that it was not catastrophes that had shaped the earth, but the very forces that we see working around us now. Erosion, glaciation, volcanism, and that the earth was much more ancient, not thousands, but millions of years old. And this was confirmed when I climbed to the high points in South America and I found marine strata, shells of marine life, thousands of feet above the sea, told me that almost the entire continent of South America had been uplifted from that sea, perhaps through volcanism, through millions of years. Pattern after pattern made me question these orthodox ideas. The island forms we encountered also had their own patterns. Of course, the Galapagos archipelago, we were late in discerning what the pattern was. You see, we had been collecting, and it was late in our visit. We were about to depart when we discovered that each island had its own form of tortoise. And if you showed the carapace of a tortoise to one of the locals, they would be able to tell you which island that tortoise came from. Each of these small specks of lava had their own form of tortoise. And this made me go back and look at the mockingbirds that I had collected on those different islands. And lo and behold, I discovered there was a different form on each of the islands. I then turned to the grosbeaks that I had collected, and unfortunately I had not written down what island they had come from. Indeed, they were not even grosbeaks. When I returned to England, John Gould corrected me and told me they were actually finches. But again, the question that came to mind, why create a special form on each of these islands, these small specks of volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean off the coast of South America? Yes, God sees every sparrow fall, but does he create these forms on such small, insignificant islands? Especially making them so similar to the forms on the mainland. How much more sense it made to me that some ancestral form had arrived from the mainland on the island and through time changed into these other forms that we could see were clearly related and yet uniquely different. These were the ideas that I returned to England with. But I was missing an important part. I believed species changed, new species arose, but I did not know how. The mechanism had escaped me until I read a paper by Malthus. Malthus argued and pointed out quite correctly, it seemed to me, that human populations grow geometrically, whereas food production grows arithmetically. And so human populations would always outstrip the resources, and there would always be a struggle for food, strife, starvation. I immediately began to think about the animal kingdom. Overproduction was rife in the animal kingdom. Far more young were produced than could survive. And there was also a struggle for the resources for those to survive. And if there were variations within a species, if those variations affected their abilities to survive, those with the best structures for surviving would be selected to reproduce and pass those structures on to their offspring. And so, year by year, generation by generation, we would see new forms arising from the old, changing, being selected by nature herself. I had the mechanism. I wrote my ideas to my friend Joseph Hooker, and he replied, he thought there was merit in the idea, but he also noted, he said, Charles, I think you might be a bit presumptuous to try to explain to the world how all species have come to be when you have not even studied one species in detail yourself. He was right. Who would take me as an expert who had never studied anything in any detail? And so I decided I would have to study a group of organisms to know them better than anyone else, and to see if they too told me the story of evolution through natural selection. At the time, many learned men had pointed out that there was one group of invertebrates that were poorly known. These were the Cirripedia, the barnacles. I had been interested in barnacles since the voyage, for when I was walking on a beach in Chile, I came upon a large gastropod shell, and at first I thought someone had shot it with shotgun, for there were small holes across the entire shell. And yet when I looked, I thought I could see something in those holes, so I took it back to the ship, and I looked at it under a glass, and lo and behold, what did I see? A 1/10 of an inch, tiny, naked barnacle, hiding in each hole. Now you see, barnacles are amazing. Barnacles are sessile organisms. They don't move. Once the larval form finds a home, it glues itself to the substrate, undergoes an amazing metamorphosis, which normally includes calcareous shells forming around the organism. And so, for example, this is a fine example of one genus, Balanus, one of the larger of the species of Balanus. And you can see multiple individuals here have settled, become sessile, and the organism is hidden inside. And when you're looking, you might think it must be a mollusk of some sort, sessile, inside a calcareous shell. But when you look at the organism inside, you find jointed limbs that are strikingly similar to lobsters and crabs. It is no mollusk, it is a crustacean, hidden here. But my little stranger that I had found in Chile, I nicknamed him Mr. Arthrobalanus. That's the way I wrote about him in my notes, Mr. Arthrobalanus. Arthro for his jointed limbs, Balanus because I assumed he might be related to this most common of genera. Well, Mr. Arthrobalanus, I later learned, was not Mr. Arthrobalanus at all. You see, most barnacles are hermaphrodites with both male and female. It turned out that Mr. Arthrobalanus was actually female. It was Mrs. Arthrobalanus after all. But then I had to ask myself, well, where is the male? And I soon discovered that what I thought were very small ticks attached to the body of Mr., now Mrs. Arthrobalanus, were in fact not ticks, but the male of the species. And he had been reduced to nothing much more than a packet of sperm. So, I was already interested in barnacles. Barnacles. Had I only known. Had I only known. Well, I began my study, and barnacles began arriving on the trains and coming to Downhaven. Barnacle descriptions that were arriving in the post. My study filled with barnacles. I became a barnacle myself, attached to one spot, doing nothing but studying barnacles. 4 volumes, 8 years of my life. But I was proud of that work. But I will tell you this, when I finished, I hated barnacles more than any man on earth. More than the crustiest sailor who had to scrape them from the hull of ships for his whole life. I was told that at one point my son George, my children are often in my study and help me with my experiments, but I was told that George visited a friend of his at that time. And his friend took him into the study of his father. And George looked around and said, well, where are his drawers and his jars? And the child said, he has no drawers and jars. And I said, well, George said, well, where does he keep his barnacles? Of course, every child's father studies barnacles. But during that work, so, barnacles, 4 volumes. The description of our voyage, that took time, sorting specimens, working with others to describe all the specimens I brought back. And illness took so much of my time. But through it all, I kept working on this idea of evolution through natural selection. I collected information. I knew that to convince the world of this idea, I would have to document it. I would have to amass all the facts I could, arguments both for and against, to convince them. And I continued to work on this. And then one day, I'll never forget it, scarlet fever was running rampant through the village. Henrietta was deathly ill. And our poor little Charles was suffering from the disease that would take him from us. And then in the post, I receive a letter from a young naturalist in the Malay archipelago by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. And in this packet, I find a paper which describes evolution by natural selection in more lucid prose than I could ever hope to write. And in the letter, he says, would you please read this idea I have, and if you see any merit in it, could you pass it on and have it read at the Royal Society? Any merit in it? It was my idea that I had been working on for 20 years. What was I to do? I could have burned it. He was in the Malay archipelago. Letters are often lost. No, I could not burn it. I thought long and hard, and I decided that I would allow Wallace to have the credit for the idea. I would allow my book to drift into oblivion, but I would rather do that than to have anyone believe that I acted in such a paltry spirit as to steal the idea of another man. Still, it was hard. So I wrote my friends, Lyell and Hooker, and told them of my decision. I am blessed with very good friends. They wrote back and said, no, Charles, you have worked too hard. Here's what we will do. We will present Wallace's paper, but we will also take letters that you have written describing your ideas some time ago, which proves that you also had the idea, as well as a short abstract of your idea, and have them both read at the same time to the Royal Society. Of course, I was quite pleased with this outcome, and so it happened. And when they completed the reading of those papers, as I understand it, of course, my health kept me here at Down. I could not attend. I was told it was met with deafening silence. The learned men were not struck much by our ideas, I suppose. But others were. Others were, for it flew in the face of religious orthodoxy. Not the least of which was, if you took my ideas to their conclusion, not only animals and plants, but also man had arisen from some ancestor, some ape-like ancestor. And this troubled so many, especially some of those in society. I remember one lady, the story goes, when she was told that these ideas that man was descended by apes, she said, oh, well, let us hope it's not true. And if it is, let us hope it never becomes widely known. Yes. Well, I knew there would be critics, but I cannot hold an argument with any man, and I was too weak to take it on. But I had another friend, Thomas Huxley. When I shared my book with Thomas, his only comment was, Charles, it was such an obvious idea. I don't know why I didn't think of it myself. Well, that gives you an idea of what Thomas was like. Thomas had a wit as quick as a flash of lightning and as sharp as a serpent's tongue. He said, "Don't worry, Charles. I am sharpening my claws." And of course, the great debate came. Oxford in 1860, a year after we published The Origin, this little book. He was debating the Bishop of Oxford, Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a wealthy and influential man, eloquent speaker. He could enthrall people. So he stood up and attacked our ideas. He twisted what we said. He told blatant falsehoods. He denigrated us in front of that audience, much to their delight. And at the end, he turned to Huxley and he said, "Thomas, are you descended from an ape on your mother's side or your father's side?" And of course, the hoots and hollers throughout the hall could be heard far across the campus. But Thomas simply turned to his friend and said, "The Lord hath delivered him into my hands." And at that point, Thomas stood up and went through every argument that the bishop had put forward, showed the fallacy in each one brilliantly. And then at the end, he turned to the bishop and he said, "Well, if I had to choose between a poor ape and a wealthy and influential bishop who uses falsehoods to tarnish the name of simple seekers of truth, I will choose the ape." Thomas. Of course, that did not stop the debate. No, it went on and on. And I continued to do my work, each one trying to drive home more ideas in support of natural selection, the descent of man. The most important part of that book was to try to explain one of the things which my Origin of Species did not explain, which was the beautiful plumage of birds, such as the male peacock. How does one explain that beautiful form? If you have ever seen a male peacock try to rise from the ground, you know that his beautiful tail is a hindrance to that. How could natural selection, in the battle for survival, give rise to this? No, that was created by God for our aesthetic pleasures. Clearly. That is when I realized that there was another struggle. Not simply the struggle for survival, but the struggle to reproduce. It was in that struggle that these beautiful feathers would evolve. If a female found a male with a longer tail feather, a more beautiful eye, more attractive, that male would reproduce and pass his traits on to the next generation. This I termed sexual selection, to separate it from natural selection. The attacks continued, of course. I then took up the study of these beautiful, beautiful flowers, the orchids. I wrote my friend Asa Gray. I said, I think I will plan a flank attack on my critics. I will come at them from a different direction. I will discuss something like the contrivances with which orchids ensure cross-pollination. Move away from the debate about evolution of man from an ape and move to something else, which could also show the beauty and the power of natural selection. And so, by studying these flowers, I could show how the parts were changed to come about with amazingly intricate ways to ensure cross-pollination. And I thought cross-pollination was so incredibly important for maintaining that variation within species that natural selection had to work upon. And also ensuring the vigor of the plant itself. Breeding by too close of relatives often results in a weakened stock. Him and I are cousins, as were my parents. And I have often wondered whether whether that close relationship was the cause of the death of some of our children and the illnesses which I suffer and so many of my children do. I have actually asked that in the next census we ask whether those people are related to each other and how many children and sicknesses they have, so that we can answer this question. But that took me to the orchids. Amazing, amazing contrivances. There was one species, I remember, it had modified the petal to become something that I called an antenna. And if the insect touched that antenna, there was a pedestal upon which a sac of pollen sat, a sac which was covered with a sticky fluid. And it was set like a spring. And if you touched the antenna, if an insect landed there, suddenly that pedestal would spring forward and the packet of sperm would fly forward and strike the insect and stick to its head. I tried this in the study with my children. I thought they would enjoy it. And so I touched the antenna, and I was standing about a yard from the window, and a packet of pollen flew and stuck to the pane, and the children cried in delight. That night, when I went to wish them good night, as I entered their room, I was pummeled with stockings, and they cried, "Father, we are orchids, we are orchids!" Yes, yes. Well, I am now working on what I fear will probably be my last monograph. I have the subject of that monograph. Perhaps you can guess what it is. Here. He's in this dish. Do you have any guesses who the subject of my last monograph is? I will tell you. It is an organism that has probably done more to change the surface of the earth than any other organism did. Except perhaps coral polyps and what they have done in the oceans around us. The earthworm. Yes, the earthworm. I've been fascinated with these for years and years. My uncle Josiah Wedgwood had noted that there were some limestone columns that had fallen in a far part of his estate, and he had always meant to haul them away. But he told me the story that he had waited long enough, and he went out and they were completely covered with topsoil. He hired no workmen. The workmen were there in the millions in the soil. The little industrious earthworms. The plow is an amazing invention by man. But there are millions of natural plows at work, night and day, turning the soil, enriching the soil, feeding on the detritus, the leaves, enriching that soil, working night and day for us. And yet it is simply the earthworm. I have done many experiments with them. I have found that they scuttle to their burrows like a little rabbit if you turn on the light. However, if there is a potential mate present, they will forbear the light in order to reproduce. They are deaf. I know this because I had my children play a tin whistle and they did not respond. And then I thought perhaps that was too high, so we had another one play a bassoon. And again, they did not respond. However, when we placed this on the piano and struck any of the keys, immediately the worm would respond and retreat into his burrow. It was the vibration, of course. I have studied what they eat. What do you think the favorite food of my worm is? But I have found this simply by offering them various leaves in this way. And I have found they are particularly fond of cabbage and onion. But what really excites a worm, I will tell you, is a piece of meat. They are most sagacious. If you watch when they disappear into their tunnels, they are like a bricklayer. closing the opening. It seems as if there's an intelligence at work there. Amazing, amazing animals. I have joked with my children that I hope I finish my monograph on worms before I join them. I hope I can do so. In looking back on my life, I believe I have done good as a scientist. But I wish I had done more to help my fellow creatures. But I have become like a machine who produces theories from massive amounts of information. And as a result, I feel that part of my brain has atrophied. When I was young, I loved poetry of all sorts. I read Shakespeare. I especially enjoyed his historical plays. Pictures were delightful to me, music as well. But I have found in my older years, those tastes have dulled. I tried reading Shakespeare, and it nauseated me. I take no pleasure in pictures or music. If I had my life to live over again, I would make sure that every week I read a poem, or I looked at a painting, or I listened to music, in the hope that that part of my brain would not atrophy. Yep. Oh, do you hear it? They are here, the grandchild. I must leave, you know. I'm terribly sorry, but Emma will not be pleased if I stay too long. Thank you so much for visiting me here at town. I wish you safe travels home. My best. Good night. Very much. If you have questions for Darwin, I will try to do my best to answer them as he might have. Anything you might have wondered.
What did you think when Wallace dedicated his book to you?
I am most pleased by the fact that we actually became great friends. The only stumbling point was he could never accept that man had descended from apes. We differed in that. I remember writing him, "You have killed our child, Alfred." I always felt for poor Alfred. You see, I am sensible of my own status in life. I need not worry about earning a living. I have been left quite well off. Alfred has not. I don't know if you know, as a young naturalist, Alfred sailed to South America, collected many specimens, and at that time you could make a career based on what you brought back to Europe by selling those to museums. And that was what he had hoped. He would make his name, his mark, and set off his career with his collections. So he spent years in South America jungle collecting an amazing mass of specimens. And on the return voyage, a fire began in the ship upon which he sailed. It so rapidly engulfed the ship that they were lucky to escape with their lives. And here was Alfred sitting in the rowboat, watching the vessel that held his future life sink before his eyes. I worked very hard to help get him positioned as Kew Gardens. And he was able to work there for much of his life. A brilliant man, a brilliant man. Unfortunately, he became very interested in spiritualism. He was also somewhat contentious, and he could not stand the Flat Earth Society. I don't know if you know about that. This was a group which argued vehemently that the Earth was not round, but in fact was flat. Most of us just ignored them, but not Alfred. Alfred had to fight them in the courts, out of the courts, in the newspapers, out of the newspapers. Alfred, stop! I always told him. But he became very interested in spiritualism at the end. Could never accept certain tenets that I thought were obvious, outgrowths of our own ideas. But we were still good friends. Good friends. I will tell you, well, yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask, there were certain things in your book, in the first edition of your book, that you retracted. And not retracted, but did not, you said was left for other people to explore.
Well, this was something I felt was very important. This idea cannot be forwarded by a single individual. If it is to succeed, it must be taken on by many others. And one of the most gratifying things that has happened is that slowly, gradually, these ideas grew. And the most pleasing letters that I would receive would be from young scientists who were so enthralled with the idea and ready to do experiments and build upon it. That was the most pleasing, when the young took on that idea as the idea grew. There was one other change. My wife was very orthodox. And I was troubled by the fact that there had become this belief that if you believed in evolution by natural selection, you were godless, you were an atheist. And this troubled my wife greatly. And I felt this was a false dichotomy. And so, in the later editions of my book, the last paragraph, let me read it to you, and you will see the change that I made. It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. And that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. I did not have the phrase, having been originally breathed by the Creator, in the first edition, but I added it to later editions, in the hope that it might dull this dichotomy that had been created between godless evolution and God-based religion. As for myself, as I say, I started very orthodox. In fact, I used to be teased on the Beagle, because when we would get in arguments, I would also often bring forward biblical sayings to try to prove my position. But very slowly, very gradually, those beliefs began to erode. They did so slowly, I don't think I even noticed them. But I began to think about the Christian belief. If you read some of the Christian beliefs, if you do not believe in a certain way, you are damned. And that would mean that men such as my father, my brother, my friends who do not so believe are likewise damned. That to me is damnable doctrine. Some people say religious fervor that is shown by so many Christians is evident that God exists. But clearly, religious fervor of Mohammedans, of Buddhists. Tell us that you can be as religiously fervent for one God or for many gods. I have often been troubled by the cruelty I see in the world, not just the world of man, but the natural world. Parasites living on the living bodies of their host. What benevolent God would create such a scenario? These questions are beyond me. They are beyond me. I cannot answer them. So I remain an agnostic. Very well, thank you very much again. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming tonight. Seriously, I so appreciate all of you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
It's enthralling.
Yeah.
That's great.
No, this is a special group they have here tonight. And I started getting choked up when I said I had good friends. Because I truly do.
Oh, sweet.
So
That
I
was
wanna thank all of you.
enthralling, Tad. It
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks again for coming.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad.